everyone, and welcome to True Crime Man's Dark Imagination. This is Alan G., your host. If you like what you see, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. Following the defeat of the German Army in World War II, the Judge Advocate Department of the 3rd U.S. Army set up a war crimes branch which conducted 489 court proceedings in which 1,672 German war criminals were charged. This was apart from the proceedings against the major German war criminals before an international military tribunal at Nuremberg. Most of the secondary proceedings conducted by the American occupation forces were held at Dachau, on the grounds of Germany's most infamous horror camp, between November 15, 1945 and 1948. The most controversial of the Dachau proceedings, and the one that is still discussed to this day, is the infamous Malmedy Massacre case against the Waffen-SS soldiers who were accused of the murder of American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians during the intense fighting of the Battle of the Bulge. This is their story. On December 17, 1944, the second day of the Battle of the Bulge, 84 American soldiers had been executed after surrendering to an SS detachment. The 1st SS Panzer Division interrogated them. 75 of them were originally charged as war criminals in the Malmedy case. One of those who were charged was 18-year-old Arvid Freimuth, who committed suicide in his cell before the trial started. Although popularly known as the Dachau trials, these court proceedings by the American Military Tribunal at Dachau were not conducted like a typical trial in the American justice system. Guilt was established beforehand by interrogators assigned to obtain confessions from the accused, who were then presumed guilty. The burden of proof was on the defense, not the prosecution. A panel of American military officers acted as both judges and jury, and the defense attorneys were also American officers. The judges took judicial notice of the crimes that were allegedly committed, which meant that the defense was not permitted to argue that the crimes had not taken place. Hearsay testimony was allowed, and affidavits could be submitted by witnesses who did not appear in the courtroom, and thus could not be cross-examined by the defense. In some of the proceedings at Dachau, the prosecution witnesses were paid to testify. Some of the accused were not permitted to testify in their own defense. Thus, the outcome of the Malmedy Massacre proceedings was never in doubt. The accused in the proceedings included General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, who was a longtime personal friend of Adolf Hitler, and Colonel Joachim Peiper, the commanding officer of Kampfgruppen Peiper, the armored battle group which spearheaded the German attack in Hitler's Ardennes offensive, better known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. Peiper's rank was the equivalent of an American lieutenant colonel when he was assigned on December 16, 1944, to lead the tank attack. But after the battle, he was promoted to colonel. Peiper preferred to be called by his nickname, Jochen, rather than his first name, Joachim. Both Peiper and Dietrich were members of the Lebensstadt SS Adolf Hitler, an SS outfit which was established in 1933 under the command of Dietrich. SS stands for Schutzstaffel, which means protection squad in English. The SS was an elite group that was separate from the regular German army, which was called the Wehrmacht. The Schutzstaffel had started out as a private protection squad whose purpose it was to personally guard Adolf Hitler. Another branch of the SS was the SS Totenkopfverbund, which served as the guards of concentration camps. The SS was a unique branch of the German armed forces. It was a volunteer army which had many divisions made up of recruits from almost every country in Europe. The Waffen-SS soldiers swore an oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler rather than to their country, as did the Wehrmacht soldiers. The SS men were more hated by the Americans than the regular Wehrmacht soldiers. The men in all the SS Panzer tank divisions wore the Totenkopf, or the death's head symbol, on their visor caps, the same symbol that was also worn by the Einsatzgruppen when they followed behind the troops, killing the communists and Jews, when the German army invaded Russia on June 22, 1941, and the same symbol that was worn by the guards in the Nazi concentration camps. Dachau was selected as the site for the German war crimes proceedings that were conducted solely by the American military, partly because of the abundant housing available at the former concentration camp and the huge SS training camp there, but primarily because it was the place most associated with German atrocities in World War II. Of all the proceedings before the American Military Tribunal at Dachau, the one that was most highly publicized was the Malmedy Massacre case. The proceedings were filmed and scenes were shown in the newsreels in American theaters. The accused complained that they were being blinded and cooked by the hot lights needed for the movie cameras. This case was important because every schoolchild in America knew the name of the Battle of Bulge. It was the most decisive battle on the Western Front, the battle in which the Allies crushed the enemy army, leading to Germany's final defeat. Besides bringing war criminals to justice, the Nuremberg and Dachau military tribunals were designed to educate the public, both in Germany and in America, that World War II was the good war, the war fought by the American good guys against the German bad guys, who were rotten through and through, from their evil leader right down to the teenagers who died defending their country. The purpose of the Dachau military tribunals was to establish once and for all that the Germans had committed unspeakable atrocities, which were all part of an evil conspiracy masterminded by Adolf Hitler. The incident, which became known as the Malmedy Massacre, happened at the Bognez Crossroads in the Ardennes Forest in Belgium on December 17, 1944. The second day of fighting in the famous Battle of the Bulge, where American troops suffered 81,000 casualties, including 19,000 deaths in one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The German army suffered 70,000 casualties, with 20,000 dead in the month-long battle, which didn't stop even for Christmas Day. It was during this decisive battle that a number of American soldiers were taken prisoner by Waffen SS soldiers who were fighting in the battle group named Kampfgruppe Piper, which was spearheading the German attack. One of the photographs taken at the time shows some of the 72 bodies which were recovered after they were left lying in the snow until January 13, 1945, 4 weeks after they were killed. The reason given by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Unit, which eventually retrieved the bodies, was that there was still heavy fighting in the area, which was not true, according to American soldiers who participated in the fighting in the vicinity of the massacre. According to one veteran of the battle, an American infantry captain who is now deceased, the alleged massacre was a cover-up to explain why the U.S. Army waited 4 weeks to collect combat fatalities after they had been notified about the bodies by local Belgian citizens. Another 12 bodies were recovered 4 months later after all the snow had melted, making a total of 84 victims. On the day of the incident, Piper's assignment had been to capture the bridge over the Meuse in the Belgian town of Huy and hold it to the last man until General Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army could cross over it, then rush across the northern Belgian plain to take the great supply port of Antwerp, which was the main objective of Hitler's Ardennes offensive. Hitler had personally picked the route that Piper was to take, but heavy artillery fire from the 2nd U.S. Infantry Division had forced him to take an alternative route through the tiny village of Malmedy, close to the Bognez Crossroads. Piper's battle group never reached its objective, which was the bridge over the Meuse. Many of Piper's tanks were destroyed by the Allies, and after Piper ordered his men to destroy the remaining tanks and vehicles, the survivors escaped by wading and swimming across the river. Piper's men were forced to retreat on foot at a killing pace on Christmas Eve 1944. Out of the 5,000 men in Piper's unit, only 800 survived the Battle of the Bulge. Almost 1 out of 10 of the survivors was indicted as a war criminal by the victorious Allies. The Bulge Crossroads was known to the Americans as 5 Points because it was the intersection of 5 roads. There is considerable disagreement about what actually happened at 5 Points on that Sunday afternoon in 1944, when the blood of American soldiers was spilled in the snow. The victims were members of Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The function of this lightly armed technical unit was to locate enemy artillery and then transmit their positions to other units. No two accounts of the tragedy agree, not even on the number that were killed. The official report said 86 were shot, and there are 86 names on the memorial wall that has been erected at the site. But the Malmedy Massacre trial was based on the murder of 72 soldiers, whose bodies were autopsied after they were recovered on January 13, 1945, buried under 2 feet of snow. According to the story that was pieced together by the American survivors, Piper's assault unit had destroyed around a dozen American Army spotter planes that day, and had captured a group of American soldiers who had been forced to ride along as Piper's men continued down the road on their tanks. At the crossroads, the German tanks caught up with the American soldiers of Battery B, 285th Battalion, which had left the village of Malmedy and were traveling the same road, bound for the same destination. At the crossroads, the U.S. Army military policeman Homer Ford was directing traffic as a column of artillery vehicles, led by Lieutenant Virgil Larry, passed through the intersection and headed for the nearby village of St. Vith. A 5-minute battle ensued in which approximately 50 Americans were killed. Some of the Americans tried to escape by hiding in the Café Baudaume at the crossroads, but Piper's SS soldiers set the cafe on fire and then heartlessly gunned down those who tried to run out of the building. Survivors of the massacre said that the SS soldiers then assembled those who had surrendered after the battle in a field beside the cafe. There were 3 eyewitnesses to the event: the owner of the cafe, Madame Baudaume, a 15-year-old boy, and a German-born farmer, Henri Le Joly. None of these witnesses were called to testify at the military tribunal in Dachau. According to Charles Whiting in his book entitled The Traveler's Guide to the Battle for the German Frontier, the Americans huddled in a field to the right of the pub, some of them with their hands on their helmets in token of surrender, others smoking and simply watching the SS armor pull away. Leaving their POWs virtually unguarded, it was so quiet that Madame Baudaume and Le Joly came out of hiding to watch what was going on. Piper's tank unit continued down the road after leaving behind a few SS men to guard the prisoners. Legend has it that Lieutenant Colonel Piper, who had an excellent command of the English language, passed the scene and called out to the American prisoners, "It's a long way to Tipperary." According to Whiting's book, Piper had heard that an American general was in the next village and he was on his way to capture him. General Dwight D. Eisenhower mentioned in his autobiography, Crusade in Europe, that there was some concern among the American generals about being captured, although he didn't mention Piper by name. At the Dachau proceedings, Lieutenant Virgil Larry was able to identify Private First Class George Fleps, a Waffen SS soldier from Romania who allegedly fired the first 2 shots with his pistol. Some versions of the story say that he fired a warning shot in the air when several prisoners tried to make a run for it. Other versions say that he deliberately took aim and shot one of the Americans. Panic ensued, and the SS soldiers then began firing upon the prisoners with their machine guns. The survivors testified that they heard the order given to kill all the prisoners. Macht all kaputt. According to the testimony of the 3 survivors who played dead, the SS murderers were laughing as they walked among the fallen U.S. soldiers and shot those who still showed signs of life. The autopsy showed that 41 of the Americans had been shot in the head, and 10 had head injuries consistent with being bashed with a rifle butt. Curiously, most of the victims were not wearing their dog tags, although all of them were identified by their personal effects, since there were no wallets or watches taken by the Germans. 42 of the accused were sentenced to death, but all the sentences were commuted to life after a congressional investigation determined that there had been misconduct by members of the prosecution team. The exact number of soldiers who surrendered to the Germans is unknown, but according to various accounts, it was somewhere between 85 and 125. After the captured Americans were herded into the field at the crossroads, They were allegedly shot down by Waffen SS men from Piper's battle group in what an American TV documentary characterized as an orgy motivated by German joy of killing. 43 of the Americans taken prisoner that day managed to escape and lived to tell about it. One of them was Kenneth Ahrens, who was twice shot in the back. 17 of the survivors ran across the snow-covered field and made their way to the village of Malmedy, where they joined the 291st Engineer Battalion. The massacre occurred at approximately 1 p.m. on December 17th, and the first survivors were picked up at 2:30 p.m. on the same day by a patrol of the 291st Engineer Battalion. Their story of the unprovoked massacre was immediately sent to General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander of the war in Europe, who made it a point to disseminate the story to reporters covering the battle. One of the news reporters at the Battle of the Bulge was America's famous writer Ernest Hemingway, who was covering the war for Collier's magazine. When the gory details of the Malmedy Massacre reached the American people, there was an outcry for justice to be done. To this day, the Malmedy Massacre is spoken of as the single worst atrocity perpetrated by the hated Waffen SS soldiers. During the proceedings, the prosecution contended that Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Piper had instructed his men to fight as they had fought against the Russians, disregarding international law about the treatment of prisoners of war. The defendants testified that they had been instructed to take no prisoners, but they understood this to mean because they were fighting in a tank unit, they were supposed to send POWs to the rear to be picked up by infantry units. Besides the killing of 72 American soldiers at the Bognay crossroads near the village of Malmedy, there were many other charges against the 73 accused. The charge sheet specifically stated that the 73 accused men did at or in the vicinity of Malmedy, Onsfield, Boulingen, Lignoville, Staumont, La Glaise, Chenot, Petitière, Trois-Ponts, Stavelot, Wanne, and Loutrebois, all in Belgium, at sundry times between 16th December 1944 and 13th January 1945, willfully, deliberately, and wrongfully permit, encourage, aid, abet, and participate in the killings, shooting, ill treatment, abuse, and torture of members of the armed forces of the United States of America, then at war with the German Reich, who were then and there surrendered and unarmed prisoners of war in the custody of the then German Reich. The exact names and numbers of such persons being unknown, aggregating several hundred, and of unarmed civilian nationals, the exact names and numbers of such persons being unknown. In all, the accused were charged with murdering between 538 to 749 nameless prisoners of war and more than 90 unidentified Belgian civilians in the locations mentioned on the charge sheet. The accused SS men claim that the civilians who were killed had been actively aiding the Americans during the fight. The prosecution claimed that General Sepp Dietrich, on direct orders from Hitler himself, had urged the SS men to remember the German civilians killed by the Allied bombing, and to disregard the rules of warfare that were mandated by the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Geneva Convention of 1922. This meant that all of the accused were charged with participating in a conspiracy of evil that came from the highest level, the moral equivalent of the Nazi conspiracy to exterminate all the Jews in Europe, which was one of the charges against the major German war criminals at Nuremberg. The Malmedy Massacre proceedings were conducted like a U.S. Army court-martial, except that only 2/3 majority vote by the panel of 8 judges was needed for conviction. Each of the accused was assigned a number because it was hard to keep the names of the 73 men straight. They all wore their field uniforms, which had been stripped of the double lightning bolt SS insignia and all other military emblems and medals. The proceedings lasted for only 2 months, during which time both the prosecution and the defense presented their cases. Fearful that they might incriminate themselves on the witness stand, their defense attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Everett, who believed that they were guilty, persuaded most of the SS soldiers not to testify on their own behalf. Colonel Joachim Piper volunteered to take all of the blame if his men could go free, but this offer was declined by the court. After only 2 hours and 20 minutes of deliberation by the panel of judges, all 73 of the accused SS soldiers were convicted. Each of the accused was required to stand before the judges with his defense attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Everett, by his side as the sentence was read aloud. 42 of the accused were sentenced to death by hanging, including Colonel Piper. Piper made a request through his defense attorney that he and his men be shot by a firing squad, the traditional soldier's execution. His request was denied. General Sepp Dietrich was sentenced to life in prison along with 21 others. The rest of the accused were sentenced to prison terms of 10, 15, or 20 years. None of the convicted SS soldiers were ever executed, and by 1956, all of them had been released from prison. All of the death sentences had been commuted to life in prison. As it turned out, the Malmedy Massacre proceedings at Dachau, which were intended to show the world that the Waffen SS soldiers were a bunch of heartless killers, became instead a controversial case which dragged on for over 10 years and resulted in the criticism of the American occupation, the war crimes military tribunals, the Jewish prosecutors at Dachau, and the whole American justice system. Before the last man convicted in the Dachau proceedings walked out of the Landsberg prison as a free man, the aftermath of the case had involved the U.S. Supreme Court, the International Court at The Hague, the U.S. Congress, Dr. Johann Neuhausler, who was a survivor of the Dachau concentration camp and a bishop in Munich, and the government of the new Federal Republic of Germany. All this was due to the efforts of defense attorney Lieutenant Colonel Willis M. Everett. Eventually, all 73 of the convicted German war criminals in the Malmedy Massacre case were released from Landesberg prison, including Colonel Piper, who was freed on December 22, 1956, the last of the accused to finally walk out of Landesberg prison. In fact, this was the same prison where Reichsfuhrer Rudolf Hess had been sentenced to life after the war and where he eventually died. After scrutiny from some of the most intellectual jurists in the world, most of the sentences were commuted from death to life in prison. The bodies of the Malmedy Massacre victims were buried in temporary graves at Henri Chapelle, 25 miles north of the village of Malmedy. The temporary cemetery was made into a permanent military cemetery after the war, and 21 of the murdered heroes of the Battle of the Bulge are still buried there. A stone wall has been erected as a memorial in honor of all the victims of the Malmedy Massacre near the site of the tragedy. The problem with these tribunals stems from the fact that there were still dead Americans and no one was held accountable. Perhaps the Germans that survived their sentences felt that they had escaped justice, but they paid for their crimes somehow, if not in this life, then in the next. If you enjoyed what you saw, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes. Also, if you feel like contributing to the channel, you'll find us on PayPal and Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. Until next time.